What would lead a first-century rabbi to travel thousands of miles by sea and by land, to be beaten, imprisoned, and ultimately beheaded for his faith? It was a call to turn the world upside down. This is the story of the Apostle Paul, whose writings continue to shape the lives of 1/3 of the world's population. A man second only to Jesus in his impact and influence on the Christian faith, and whose witness defines what it means to be a follower of Jesus Christ. After Paul and Barnabas were set apart by the believers in Syrian Antioch, they made their way to the coast and boarded a ship that would have looked something like the one you see here. And they would have traveled thousands of miles on ships like this across the course of, or Paul would have, over the course of the next 15 years, 20 years. And they made their way to Cyprus. Now, Cyprus was Barnabas' hometown, or home island. This is where he was from. And Barnabas, John Mark, his younger cousin, and Paul make their way to Cyprus. They travel across by land as they're ministering, as they're preaching and offering Christ. And then finally, they leave the island of Cyprus and make their way by ship over to Perga. Now, Perga was no small city. It was a major city here in this particular region. It was the capital city of the province. And though Luke doesn't tell us much of what happens here, only that they entered Perga, and then later on they came back through and Paul proclaimed the gospel. What we know is that Paul, Barnabas, they entered through these city gates as they began their missionary journey in Asia Minor. And so we enter through these same gates today. And we remember the fact that Paul walked here in this place as he was launching his mission to Asia Minor. In Perga, you find fine examples of great ruins from the time of the Apostle Paul and earlier. And then you see this amazing main street with really two roads going through it. So you have a very large example of a cardo, or of a marketplace, with the main streets with shops lining the streets. So Paul would have traveled from Perga up the plain alongside the Sestris River, which we're standing in front of now. An old Roman road ran along the Sestris River and made its way up into the mountain pass through the Taurus Mountains and up to Pisidian Antioch. And so you can see, many people picture Paul, traversing across desert-like, or dry, flat terrains in Turkey, but that's not what he was walking across. He was getting ready to cross the Taurus Mountains, ascending 5,000 feet to go to Pisidian Antioch. It would have taken him about 3 weeks to make this journey, I think, because he would have had to stop where there were water sources along the way. So he and Barnabas making their way along the river as long as it traversed, and then along the Roman road up the Taurus Mountains to Pisidian Antioch. Let's head that direction. After traveling for 2 or probably 3 weeks, Paul and Barnabas finally arrive to the town of Pisidian Antioch. They have traveled across the mountains you see in the background, the Taurus Mountains, and they've come up in elevation to a city that's probably 3,000 to 4,000 feet above sea level. And in Perga, the temperature there was about 10 degrees warmer than it is here, but the relative humidity was about 90%, whereas here the humidity is low, the temperatures are a little bit lower, and so this would have been a place that was much more comfortable. Some have suggested that Paul was sick. In fact, Paul says that he came to Galatia and preached there because he wasn't feeling well because of his illness. He came here, and so perhaps that had something to do with the temperatures in this region. I'm standing on the Roman road leading into the city, and as we walk into Pisidian Antioch, I just let you know this was a large city built on a hilltop. It was a city of some 15 to 20,000 residents. That's a huge city in Asia Minor at the time. He'll come to the city 4 times in total. So on each of his missionary journeys, he's going to come here, and on this journey, his first journey, he comes here twice. As he enters the city, he begins to preach, and as he's coming back from visiting the towns of Iconium, Lystra, and Derbe, he's going to come here again. So let's make our way into Pisidian Antioch. This is one of the main streets coming through the town of Pisidian Antioch, and there's no question that Paul walked up and down these streets many times in his 4 visits to this town. And as you come in, you see the old Roman stones, the old Roman road, and then you see that the streets are lined with shops. So everywhere you look, on every side of the main streets, and this was true in almost every Roman town, really almost every ancient town of any size, is you had shops lining the streets. And so today we think of open-air malls as sort of the new thing in shopping for Americans, but this is how people shopped in the Roman Empire. And the size of it was maybe 12 feet by perhaps 8 feet. And the shopkeepers would offer their wares here. People would either come in or they'd be served from the entryway. And you can still see here where the door posts were and where the locks would go to keep the shop locked at night. So this is an example of shopping in Pisidian Antioch. At the high point of Pisidian Antioch, the town of Pisidian Antioch, stood a temple. It was the center of town. Everybody could see it when you came into town. And that temple was dedicated to Augustus Caesar. He was deified and considered a son of God, as well as Lord of the universe and King of kings. And this temple was meant to honor him. And in this city, Paul came and he was announcing a different kind of king. He announced Jesus Christ as the King of kings and the Lord of lords, the Lord of the universe and the Son of the Most High God. And as he came and preached that message in this town, there were some who were immediately drawn to it and others who were angered by it. And ultimately, they would throw him out of town. Paul was a rabbi and a Pharisee, and he was trained in preaching and in teaching. And so his strategy when he would go and share the good news across the empire on his missionary journeys is he would start with the Jews. He would go to the synagogue. And as he was asked to proclaim or to teach on a particular passage, somehow he would always find a way of tying that passage back into the gospel of Jesus Christ. Behind me is a church that was built in the 300s, and it was dedicated to St. Paul. And this church, some believe, was built atop the site where the old synagogue had been that Paul first preached in when he came to Pisidian Antioch. And he goes through in what is the longest recorded sermon of Paul found in the scriptures here in Pisidian Antioch. He begins with God's deliverance of his people from slavery in Egypt. He takes them to King David, and then he talks about how the descendant of King David, Jesus, was the Messiah, who suffered and died and rose again, and how he died for the forgiveness of sins. And then he invited people to become followers of Jesus. Now, on that first day, the Jews and the Gentiles were very interested in what he had to say. And when he came back the next week, so undoubtedly he was teaching throughout the week, but when he came back to the synagogue the next week, Acts tells us there was a huge crowd of people. And many of the Gentiles in particular were drawn to this Jewish Messiah, Jesus. And yet that upset many of the Jews in the synagogue who then turned some of the Gentiles of the town away from Paul. And after that second week, Paul and Barnabas were asked to leave the town. In fact, they were really almost driven out of the town. So Paul leaves Antioch and he travels eastward to the cities of Iconium, Lystra, and Derbe. If you were to visit these sites today, all you'd find is large hills. These are called tells, and they're man-made hills. The cities would be destroyed by earthquake or war or fire, and then the people would rebuild the city on top of the old ruins. And they would bring in a layer of dirt, they would flatten things out, they would start all over again. And then when that city was destroyed again, another century later, it would be flattened out and a new city would be built on top of the former remains. And so over time, the cities were built up higher and higher. And then when the city was finally abandoned, nature took over and it just became a large hill. Archaeologists love to excavate these sites. And as you begin to strip away layer after layer, the lower you go, the further back in time you're going. But today, all we can see are just a few ruins and rocks that spring up from the soil, and then these large hills. And we remember it was in these places that Paul proclaimed the gospel and started some of his first churches in Asia Minor. Barnabas, whose name was Joseph, was given the name Barnabas by the disciples. And in the book of Acts, it says they called him Barnabas because Barnabas means son of encouragement. It literally means son of a prophet, but for them it was son of encouragement. And Barnabas was the one, you'll remember, who went and found Paul after his conversion and assured the believers that it was safe to be with Paul. He took him to Jerusalem and introduced him to the apostles. It was Barnabas who found Paul when he was in Tarsus and brought him back to Syrian Antioch to be sent out on the mission field. And it was Barnabas who said, I'll go with you. I'll go with you on this mission. He was an encourager to Paul. Paul needed that. He needed his encouragement. He needed his wisdom. He needed him to come alongside him. And the same is true for every one of us. We all need an encourager. We all need a Barnabas in our lives, somebody who comes alongside us to encourage us, to give us strength, to help us have wisdom, to walk the right path, and to do the things that God calls us to do. But listen, you're also called, every one of you, to be an encourager, to be a Barnabas for someone else. There's somebody who needs you to come alongside them, to mentor them, encourage them, to stand with them, to give them courage. So I'd ask you this question: who is your Barnabas? And for whom are you a Barnabas?